Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 8. Let's get the slideshow started here. So this week, we continue our conversation on imagining Native Americans through the 2 articles by Merskin. In the first article, she talks about representational ethics and defines this as having to consider who has the right to represent others and under what circumstances, and also that it requires understanding the potential consequences to people of color of using certain images. And so she's really, through both of her articles, looking at ways in which the use of representation ethics could have been useful in avoiding some of the negative images of Native American women and other Native Americans in advertising. So in this particular article, she takes on the term squaw and discusses the movement to change place names that use this term and talks about all the many different kinds of places, locations, sites that use this term as part of their name. She talks about sort of the history of this term and the meaning surrounding it and why it's degrading to Native American women, talking about how in some Native languages, this word means vagina or female genitalia. So when this term is used to talk about Native American women, you're really just objectifying them, reducing them to just a body part. And she talks about how this image is used in contrast to the image of Pocahontas, or the Pocahontas princess. And as the reading discusses in this quote, where the princess was beautiful, the squaw was ugly, even deformed. Where the princess was virtuous, the squaw was debased, immoral, a sexual convenience. Where the princess was proud, the squaw lived a squalid life of servile toil, mistreated by her men, and open and available to non-Native men. So this serves in a way as a controlling image, the same way we were talking about controlling images for African-American women. And the reading talks about this image of the squaw drudge, where her husband is perceived as lazy and shirks his responsibilities, and she's sexually promiscuous and has many children, and how this image serves as a rationalization for subordination of Native peoples. The squaw is primitive, old, ugly, and totally lacking in grace, refinement, or eroticism. Somewhat similar to how we talked about the mammy. The squaw is a papoose breeder. She's often shown slaving away over domestic chores while her husband slacks off. She sometimes has a papoose strapped to her back while working. To that end, the squaw sometimes serves as a tool by which the Indian male can be depicted as lazy and lacking moral character. So not only is it a negative image of the women, but also serves as a way to represent a negative image of Native American men as well. In contrast to the realities of Native American women, we see how there are significant disparities in healthcare experienced by Native American women. They have less education and more poverty compared to other groups. And there's a significant number who experience violence, including domestic abuse and sexual assault. And the clip here will take you to a brief clip talking about what we are seeing right now of a movement around missing and murdered women, Native American women. We see this in particular coming up with recent cases of other women who have been missing or murdered, and how there's more attention paid to when the victim is white versus this ongoing crisis that's been going on within Native American communities. The other reading talks about Native images in advertising and how these images are used to sell particular products. Talks about what the functions of images are in advertising. They're used to create a meaning for the consumer, connects the consumers to images that resonate with them, and connects consumers to their values. So the particular images that are used of Native Americans are images that resonate for a predominantly white consumer audience based on the limited information and images that they already have about Native American populations. So the stereotypical images that we find in advertising are usually of the noble savage, as stoic, innocent, and a child of nature. The civilizable savage as the one who is redeemable and teachable, or the bloodthirsty savage to represent being fierce, predatory, or animalistic. And the article goes on to look at a number of examples that use different images of Native Americans and how they use these images to attribute certain characteristics to their products. So for instance, she talks about the Land O'Lakes and the Sioux Bee Honey companies. And here you see the two different images that are being used. So you have the image of an Indian maiden or a child, situated amidst a nature kind of background, as we see in the Land O'Lakes image, and it's associated with the ideas of youth, innocence, nature, and purity. So if you're selling these particular kinds of products, like the honey, for example, you want to be able to attribute some of these characteristics to that particular product. And I apologize about the noise in the background. You might see my dog's tail moving around. It's the only way that I can keep him somewhat quiet is to have them in the room with me and playing with the toys. So I apologize for that noise. The other company she talks about is this sugar company, which uses the image of a Native American chief, and it's a combination of the images of the noble and bloodthirsty savage. On the one hand, he represents pride, nobility, and sort of the natural environment, and at the same time communicates strength and stoicism. And finally, there is this particular company, malt liquor company, who used the image of Crazy Horse. And here we have a interesting difference. Shh, please go quiet. An interesting difference from the previous two companies, because they're using an image of an actual person, of an actual historical person. So they're using the name of Crazy Horse, who was a revered leader of the Oglala Sioux tribe of South Dakota, who died in 1877 and who was against the introduction of alcohol to Native people. So it's particularly offensive for this indigenous group to be using his image on an alcoholic beverage. Here he is used to represent ideas of Indians as warriors and how mighty the consumer might feel by drinking this particular alcohol. These two links take you to, well, the first one takes you to a clip that talks about the American Indian Museum's exhibit called Americans. And the second link actually takes you to an online version of the exhibit where you can see some of the images that it's being talked about. And so I wanted to include this and give you an opportunity to look at it because it brings us to a much more contemporary time and how these images are still relevant today and how they are looked at critically from a Native American perspective. So I will, as always, include these links in the Canvas page so that you can easily access them and be able to watch them and explore the exhibit. So that brings us to the end of our lecture for this week. Make sure that you don't forget to take your midterm quiz this week. And I wish you a lot of luck with that as well. I'll see you next week.